Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, my guest today is known as one of the nicest men in British politics. Simon Richards is Chief Executive of the Freedom Association. The Freedom Association was formed back in the 1970s. He joined it as a schoolboy in 1976. Since then, it's become well known for its various campaigns, such as Axe the TV Tax and indeed Better Off Out. But its main guiding principles has been the promotion of freedom, individual freedom, and freedom of expression. Simon, thank you very, very much for coming in.
Absolute pleasure.
It might be a good thing to start off with your original, as it were, mission statements, maybe the wrong way of putting it, but that is the protection and promotion of freedom and individual liberty. Where are we at the moment with freedom? What's the state of freedom in Britain?
Well, if I may just say that you very accurately laid out what we're about, but I would add just one thing which I think makes us very different from the numerous other groups on the sort of broadly libertarian sort of centre-right. And that's we've always had the belief in the nation state. We've always felt that nationhood is important.
Right.
And you won't get that, I think, in the Adam Smith Institute or the Centre for Policy Studies and the organisations such as that. And I think that in a way leads me on to answer, attempting to answer your question, which is that we have, it seems to me, we have now all manner of petty freedoms. We have 100 different choices of washing powder. We can go pretty much anywhere we want in the world. We can listen to any bit of music on Spotify or whatever. We can buy any book. So we have those what I'd call sort of low-grade freedoms, which are very nice, very pleasant. I think we've never had more of those, and that, in a way, has meant that. But I think what has suffered has been freedom of thought and freedom of expression, which I think has been deliberately closed down by the left.
So you're saying maybe that freedom is not the same as just choice. What you're talking about is choice, surely,
yes,
isn't it?
That's true. So we have plenty of choice, but in reality, the really big issues, what I call I was always a big fan of George Orwell, and what it's called those big Orwellian issues, if you like, of real freedom to speak and to think and to dare say. Those are the areas I think that have been closed down.
So you think that compared to when you joined as a schoolboy, that essentially we are less free on that front?
Unquestionably, in my view. I didn't want to make out that it was all perfect then. I mean, I remember being at university when the left had no platform for racists and fascists. It's not as new as people think. And I can remember seeing Hayek, for example, banned from speaking at the London School of Economics on those grounds. Keith Joseph was on numerous occasions. I chaired a meeting with Dr. Rhodes Boyson, who's a then very famous sort of conservative educationalist, and it was broken up by left-wing thugs from the LSE across the road. I was at King's College London, and so. I'm not pretending, and there was an enormous violence there. I mean, I can remember going to Conservative Party conferences, and you had to fight your way through the pickets. So, a lot of this goes back perhaps further than we think. But I think that it's become more insidious, and I think the left's hold over the media and has become much more powerful. I think. In those days, the BBC, for example, I don't think was as biased as it has become. And also, I think the universities were much smaller then, and fewer of them. In my case, there were only 3,000 at my university, about 30,000 now. But and there seems to be a university in virtually every town. And so that whole, what I call Guardianist commentariat, university, so to speak, often people doing absolutely worthless degrees to no benefit of themselves or anybody else, I think has created this wonderful breeding ground for left-wing ideas, which is closing any alternative view down.
But back in, say, 1975, when the thing was started, and when you joined when you were very, very, very young, is it right to say, therefore, that you were looking at freedom and issues about freedom in economic terms? You know, you mentioned the nation.
Yes.
You said we've always believed in the nation state.
Yep.
Although at the time, surely then people didn't talk much about the nation state, did they?
It would. You're right. It was principally seen as economics. You know, and remembers all the strikes and you know the national industries going down the pan, Britain being the sick man of Europe, and all of that. And yes, I think that was my main motivation. I have to say, on a personal note, if I may go back even further than my school days, the very first sort of political memory I ever had, and it's really stuck with me, and I suppose one embellishes these things at the time, was when I must have been about five or 6 years old, watching Churchill's funeral.
Right.
Now, I'm not, I wasn't a Tory boy like William Hague. You know, I wasn't, reading political speeches that time. But I was obviously a little bit interested, and of course that was a massive event. And the thing is, I loved history. I'd read all about history about this country, about and everything. And I think I saw this, obviously, this last great world leader that we had, and revered him. And then afterwards, I saw Harry Wilson, so in his Ganex Mac and talking about the pound in your pocket, and it was a terrible shock to me. I felt this was we were really something special in this country, and then we just seemed to be a nation, as far as I could see, that just had lost any self-belief.
Yes.
As nations do. If you look at, Italy, the great, the country that created the Roman Empire, by the 19th century, you'd get these tourists going to Venice, a massive admirer of the Venetian Republic, which had a huge influence on this country, this country's politics and economics. But you get British tourists going there and saying, the locals just sort of seem to just not have any sort of any get up and go. They're just sort of slouching around. They're ignorant, and these countries, nations can change dramatically fast. I often feel now when you look at the Victorians, the self-belief that they had, that had vanished by the 70s. We'd come to believe. I think we'd gone from the one extreme of thinking we could do anything to thinking that we couldn't do anything. Yeah. And I suppose a big turning point then for me was afterwards. That was always in the back of my mind. I think it came to the fore with what was for me was the most the occasion that had the biggest impact on me after that, which was the Falklands War.
Right.
And that's where I think it changed for me, from being principally about economics to actually being more important than that. And that was a huge eye-opener for me. It was only a tiny fraction of what people had gone through in the Second World War, but it just gave you an inkling. And I particularly remember that point when initially everybody was getting on the side and wanted to support us, and then when it was clear that we were actually going to fight, they all sort of backed away. But it just gave a tiny feeling of what it might have been like in 1940 for people.
Yes.
When actually it was only when everybody else had given up that I think we regained our self-belief, thanks to Churchill, and this time thanks to Thatcher. And there was a blessed relief about not having to sort of think, we can't say this because it'll upset the Spanish. We just thought, right, we're going to do this.
The thing is that the things that stay in our minds, certainly the things that stay in my mind, like yours, are uneconomic national events. Whether they are Churchill's funeral, whether they are, I don't know, some big celebration, or whatever, and same with the Falklands. You mentioned the Falklands there, and obviously it's been this great TV documentary about Thatcher that's been going on, which is great. And I think, to be fair, reasonably even-handed.
Very much so, I thought.
But the point is that was a time where, as you're saying, it appeared that the country had got some self-belief back, maybe compared to the 1970s. it seems surely that has seeped away again, maybe?
I would completely agree. I mean, I was always interested in the cultural side of things. More than any of my contemporary sort of right wingers, and so I remember buying a book in that called "Authors Take Sides on the Falklands," and I think there were only about 3 that were in favour of the war, and very strongly so. I remember Kingsley Amis was one, Roald Dahl was another, and I can't even remember who the third one was. But they were overwhelmingly about 90% against it. It's all the great playwrights, the Alan Bennett's of this world, and the left-wing establishment. Then they were hostile to the war. So there was an element of this then that these sort of what I call these rather effete sort of left liberal people who thought, oh, it's frightfully infantile to fight to defend your country.
Oh yes, and I remember going to see a play called Sink the Belgrano, which was I think it was with Stephen Berkoff. I think it was, but I mean that's what you kind of expect in a way from the arts establishment.
Yeah. But you are right; it has got much worse. I do agree.
But then why? You see, it seems if one is going to take a really doom-laden approach, if you like, you could say that when Thatcher was around, that suddenly there was a bit of an electric bolt went through something. But then when she had gone, it's almost as though we carried on our way down in that way.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. The thing is that really, ever since Thatcher, I think this nation state has been undermined in so many ways. Obviously the European Union is one of the principal ways, but I think you've just had a breed of politicians. It's actually been like back to the 60s to me, who see themselves as career politicians managing decline, and in a way I think had it not been for Thatcher, I mean, take the Falklands for example. I'm sure someone like Philip Hammond would love to get rid of the Falklands, but because that has become a sort of iconic thing now, that if you're going weak on the Falklands, you'd be looking, very feeble. None of them dare do it. So she's, I think what she did has in a way made us a bit more ready to fight than in some ways we were before her. But I think the problem is a series of ill-judged wars, I think, have really undermined that, and of course, particularly I think the second Gulf War, and this sense that under Blair that it wasn't things being done for Britain, but for some sort of concept maybe to please the Americans. And personally, I was not a neocon, and I think that the neocon concept damaged things. There's this idea of going into interfere in the Middle East. Let's be honest, those regimes were pretty rotten, but often what happened as a result afterwards was even worse. And I think that was because it suddenly became fine to have military intervention to change another country's type of government, but not fine to sort of say, oh yes, we'll do this to defend British interests. And I just think there's been this long undermining of the nation state. We all know that immigration's a part of that, and my own view on that is I'm all for immigration. I think you have to have it. The most successful societies, the United States and the United Kingdom, I think you can argue the two most successful societies over the past 300 years have always been open to immigrants. But these things are a numbers game.
We're not really. I don't think I've come across very many people who do not like immigration in principle, or should I say, they don't have a problem with immigration in principle. It's not a question of that. As you say, it's entirely that we are not talking really about that anymore. We're talking on historically unprecedented scale, and that entirely changes the whole thing. Yep. I just want to go back to something you were saying. I think it's a very, very interesting and very good point. This point about freedom and choice, and that we have micro freedoms. I remember when I was living in America, you would go down the aisle in the supermarket and there'd be 100 different forms of salad dressing, and you sort of think, I have amazing choice. Is this freedom? Well, no, not really, because freedom exists in your head, doesn't it, really? Yep. Do you think there's anything in this view which I have certainly heard, is that people are quite happy with that kind of freedom and essentially don't really feel passionately about the bigger freedoms anymore? Do you think that's true?
Yes, I sadly I think there is a lot of truth in that, and I think it's partly an age thing. You know, as we saw in the I hate to come back to the EU referendum all the time, but there was no doubt that I think for a lot of the sort of younger generation, you know, they just saw it as a nice, again, it's a choice, you know, I can go, you know, for a weekend to Paris or whatever, which of course they could have done before, but they didn't, I don't think they realised they could have done it before.
Yes.
Because, you know, and you tend to know your own experience. Yes, I think that is crucial. And I think it's almost like an exchange. I think in the same way, MPs, the MPs, it seems to me, enter into sort of an unspoken sort of Faustian pact, where they, in exchange for them having better pay, better, you know, shorter hours, better conditions, you know, and generally better life at Westminster, you know, where they used to just have a little, you know, cubbyhole. In exchange for all of that, and also for an extension of the political class through things like the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, even dare I mention, you know, your own esteemed London Assembly. So the political class has done very nicely out of that and has grown and everything. But what they gave away was power, and they became emasculated, in my opinion. And the House of Commons has never, you know, tempted any sort of real to hold the EU to account, and it resembles to me what Louis XIV did to the French nobility. That he sort of tore down all their castles, everything, brought them all to Versailles, and gave them all sorts of wonderful, you know, balls and parties. And I see a great deal of that around, and I think in the same way that, yes, I think you're right. People have confused choice with freedom, and the truth is, you know, if you've got a decent standard of living and you're able to go on nice holidays and, you know, you've got a roof over your head, why would you be angry? You know, when you look at the revolutions, they tend to be where people are starving, don't they?
Yeah.
You know, I remember that one in Tunisia, which launched that Arab Spring, that was somebody set fire to you know, it's when people feel desperate, and we almost need to feel more desperate for people to really care about freedom, I think.
That is true, yes, if you're talking, again, in economic terms, that they are reasonably happy economically, materially speaking. There is a growing sense, surely, that people feel more and more hedged around when it comes to freedom of expression, i.e. not an economic thing, or indeed maybe do they care enough about that even?
Yes,
I'm just being devil's advocate here.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think coming back to this economic argument, I'm from South Wales originally, and something that really angered me was after the EU referendum, again, Joanna Trollope wrote a diary piece in The Spectator. She was plugging their book, as those diary pieces always do, and she was going on a tour around South Wales. And she put this piece and she said, what is wrong with these people? Everywhere I go, I see paid for by the European Union. European Union did this, European Union did that. And yet they people voted overwhelmingly to leave. And I thought that, in a way, encapsulates what is so wrong. The people cannot understand. And particularly, I think, the rather well-off chattering classes who rule us now, the sort of Guardianista types, and I mean, I don't think she's even a left-winger, but they just don't get it. That there's more to it than that. And I must admit, I tend to find, you know, I'm not based in London, And
You stay out of the Westminster Village a bit, don't you?
I like to have a sort of toe here, but for example, in the referendum campaign, I was one of the very, very few people who thought that we were going to win, the Leave side was going to win, because I was going around the West Country and the West Midlands. It wasn't that I was more anti-EU, it's just that I hadn't been sucked into and a lot of people I know, very, very staunch anti-EU people, didn't think we had a hope, because all their pals in London were telling them, of course, we were staying. I digress a bit there, but I think the further away you go from London, the more people value these freedoms. Actually, they haven't all been sucked into it, and it's a big change, because one of the big differences I always felt between Britain and France, and there are plenty of them, but it was that there has always been this enormous hostility between Paris and the rest of the country, and really there was nothing approaching that in this country. The links with London were much more friendly, I think. And that has changed.
Yes, I say really the same. It's the same, really, in some ways with the States. The attitude to New York, or the attitude to the West Coast. I mentioned at the beginning of the programme about one of your campaigns, which I imagine still may be ongoing, which is Axe the TV.
Yes, very much so.
Tax. And I just wonder, this is of course about the BBC licence fee. How far along do you think we are with that? Do you think that, compared to when you started the campaign, that in fact there is a general acceptance now that this simply cannot go on? Or, you see, this might be something where actually it's economics or technology which actually, really, deliver the final blow. Might it not be?
Netflix. I think there's truth in that. It's a little bit like the EU. It took 40 years to get that referendum. And it's still not gone through. And I think it's the same with the BBC. There is drip, 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 growing hostility to it. And as you rightly say, it's become less defensible because of technology. Netflix in particular. But I have to admit, I don't have a television. I watch everything on my mobile or my tablet or whatever, it's all online, and I'm an old fuddy-duddy. Goodness knows what people in the sort of teens and 20s are like, and so yes, I think in a way it's a perfect storm.
Yes, exactly.
But I think unfortunately, in practical terms, I think we're going to have to just watch that build up and build up and build up, because the last charter review, which we've been campaigning quite heavily before that to try to get some major changes there, and I think John Whittingdale was up for that. I'm not saying everything that we would have wanted.
But then didn't he drop it pretty quickly at one point?
The thing is, what happened, and certainly as I understood it, was that Dave Cameron, coming up with the referendum coming up, essentially forced, completely caved into the BBC. And what Osborne got this deal where the BBC, it was like blackmail really, the BBC agreed to pay for all the old people's licences, they're all that free, which had in the past been paid for by the government. So Osborne was happy, it was a bit of money pushed from the Treasury to the TV licence payer, and Cameron, as my understanding of it, was that Cameron wanted the BBC to, not be hostile with the general election and the referendum.
Good luck with that.
And really, Whittingdale was forced, and was most unhappy about it. His hand was forced, and unfortunately, it was all done very quickly.
Yes.
And it was one of these dirty deals. And the problem is with the time schedule now. All we can really do is try and build up that head of steam, but nothing in practice is going to be done about it, I think, until the next review, which is quite a way off. But I do think it is becoming more and more indefensible, and also the loyalty to it actually is, in that respect, it tends to be from the older people. I mean, my mum, for example, she wouldn't even consider watching the news on anything other than BBC. And a whole generation like that. Grew up with Richard Dimbleby, who was a broadcaster a genius,
Yeah.
a lot better than his sons, in my opinion. But and so there is still, there's still a great affection for the BBC, but it's vanishing day by day. I mean, I love Test Match Special, but there was when we were in the West Indies, the TalkSport, did it, and actually did it very, very well. So gradually, it's going. So I'm fairly confident that it will wither away in some form.
Maybe turn into, you want a subscription service, isn't that right?
That's right. Yeah, I think there's a lot of argument about the best way to do it, but I think that John Whittingdale's view was that essentially it should concentrate on things that could only be done by a public service broadcaster.
Yes,
so it doesn't need to be doing talent shows and things like that, which ITV can do perfectly well. But actually, I mean, I don't know if you watch any of the D-Day coverage, but by and large, I thought the BBC did that pretty well.
Yeah, they do things not quite as regularly good as they used to be in these things. I mean, they did that well. Yeah. They did the Diamond Jubilee terribly, if you remember.
I do remember, awful.
So that kind of sureness of touch, just I think.
I do agree that the chap on Sky, I think, tends to do the royal events better.
Yes, exactly. One thing before we finish, actually, so I want to ask you about as well is, you've started these things called the Freedom Zones, which you have at party conferences.
Yep.
But you've also set up the Freedom Association societies in various universities, haven't you? This, it seems to me, is one area where freedom of expression, despite what you said earlier, is really seriously under attack, isn't it? And
no question about that, and that's what I want to concentrate on. I've been a bit delayed in going further ahead with it. We used to have some very successful freedom societies around, but the minute Brexit took over everything, and Brexit didn't play that well with students generally, we didn't have the resources to do Brexit and that, so it's very reluctantly sort of backed off it, and I desperately want to get out there again, because I was very influenced, about some early influences, by Keith Joseph, actually he was shown in those very good BBC Thatcher films, and I'll never forget Keith Joseph. I mean, I saw him on a number of occasions, and he was an amazing man, and he was like John the Baptist. He was sort of was preaching. He wasn't a religious thing, but he was preaching the gospel, really, the gospel of freedom, of free enterprise, and everything. And he would take on his audiences. Oh,
exactly. He was fearless, wasn't he? He was fearless.
And he had this brilliant way he would finish, or something that he said, if the Berlin Wall were to come down to tomorrow, which way would the tide of humanity flow? This was the time of the Soviet Empire, and that always silenced them. And I think if we can, it's not, I'm not a Keith Joseph, not in his class, but there are other good people, the likes of Dan Hannan and many others. That many of them feature on your programs here.
I think where you might be at a good time for this is that students maybe are less likely. We all hear about party allegiances gradually weakening. They're more likely to go to a not explicitly partisan movement at university, something like the Freedom Association or whatever.
I think you're absolutely right there, and I often sort of joke when I'm there, said that the F word is a much easier sell to students than the C word. I'm thinking freedom and conservatism, of course. But it is. And actually, it's a softer word than. I mean, there are other people on our, again, probably the same side of us, who push the libertarian thing. But I think the minute you say libertarian, a lot of people who aren't really political geeks switch off. Whereas freedom, yes, it's more woolly, but people can understand it a bit better.
Well, look, thank you very, very much for coming this time. It's great to talk to you and to hear more about the work that you do. And I hope maybe you come back and talk a bit more about freedom in the future with us. So thank you very much. We will see you next time on So What You're Saying Is. If you haven't already, please do subscribe, won't you? Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.